Welcome to our Send Together forum on allyship and belonging in the workplace, elevating Asian-Black relations. This program is presented by Ascend Foundation with the support of our long-standing partner Deloitte. We also thank our Impact Fund partners for making programs like this possible. My name is Marco Soto, and I'm part of the team supporting this program. You can connect with me through the chat if you need technical assistance. Let me take a moment to share some important housekeeping and engagement information. Audio caption is available. Please click in the More button on the bottom right corner of your screen and click Subtitles. For our live stream audience, closed captioning is available in your YouTube controls. We encourage you to engage with others in the chat, but please be respectful. Any harassment is not allowed. Please submit any questions you may have for our panelists in the chat. Time permitting, we will hold a brief Q&A session at the end. Engage with Ascend through social media by cross-posting Ascend posts and sharing insights after this forum at AscendLeadership. Now to start the program, I'd like to introduce our President and Chairman of the Board, Anna Mock.
Hello, and welcome to Ascend. As part of our Ascend Together series, we have accelerated our exploration of how we can collectively drive more positive impacts through awareness, education, and forums to share and discuss solutions. Inter-Asian and cross-cultural allyship are core focuses of Ascend's 5-point action agenda and impact fund work. I want to take a moment to thank all of our funders and our 5-point action agenda signers for really sharing our goal to creating cultures of belonging and denouncing hate and bias in and outside of our workplaces. As you've seen in Ascend's recent release of our Elevating Asian-Black Allyship in Corporate America paper, that paper focuses on the common yet distinct experiences in U.S. history and in our workplaces of Blacks and Asians. Today's program will more deeply explore this topic. The topic of Asian and Black allyship is a very personal one for me. The first home that my family purchased was in a predominantly Black neighborhood. So I grew up with classmates who didn't look like me at all. We learned, we cried, and we celebrated together. At work, some of my greatest champions have been fellow Black leaders who shared an experience of breaking ceilings and changing stereotypes. This journey that Ascend has been on really started a few years ago. We've always talked about allyship, but clearly after the murder of George Floyd, it was really important for our Ascend community to show up for our Black colleagues and really to go on a journey to better understand that experience. And I realized through that many of us, even myself, who I consider a student of history and a student of workplace relations, had so much to learn in that. And so we continue on that exploration today. And I commend all of you who have joined us for this conversation. I was with the speakers a little bit in advance of this meeting, and we were talking about the great need to have really genuine, maybe sometimes raw, but also meaningful conversation around topics that may make us feel uncomfortable. And I couldn't think of a more special person to lead us through this provocative and deep conversation than Greg Cunningham. Greg Cunningham is the Senior Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer of U.S. Bank, and he's a member of the U.S. Bank Management Committee, reporting directly to the CEO. His DEI expertise has been showcased in numerous national and regional media outlets, including Fortune, Bloomberg, MSNBC, Harvard Business Review, American Banker, and the Washington Post. I chuckle a little bit when I read that list. We all know Greg's side hustle, and he'll talk a little bit more about that. He's very skilled at many things, including driving conversations like we're about to have. And in fact, he was recently recognized and received a National Journalism Award from the Minneapolis St. Paul Business Journal. Greg has been a friend and really a trusted advisor to me. He's the first call on many things at all night hours of the night, and Greg knows what I'm talking about. And he serves on Ascend's Asian-Black Allyship Council. So with that, Greg, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anna, for that amazing introduction. And I can't tell you how deeply honored I am to be able to help facilitate a conversation today that is so very important. And as Anna said, I really do enjoy my side hustle of having the opportunity to moderate such a distinguished panel as we have today. And as you said, to sit on and sit alongside Ascend and the work that you are doing. And I want to thank you and the entire team at Ascend for your tireless leadership on not only issues like this, but issues so important to diversity, equity, and inclusion in corporate America. I want to take a moment to introduce a very distinguished panel that we have today that is going to engage us all in a very lively discussion, one that will sort of make us think, that will stir some emotion and also give us some things to think about in terms of next steps and things that we can do to make progress. I'm going to begin by introducing David Harrison, who is a partner at Deloitte. David is a member of the U.S. firm's management team and serves as the lead client service partner for two of the firm's premier financial services industry clients. He co-chaired Deloitte's Black Action Council, whose mission is to architect and execute the firm's long-term strategy to enhance the experience and representation of Black professionals at Deloitte and enhance the firm's anti-racist culture. Very important work. David serves on the National Board of Directors, POSSE, and was a member of the American Institute of CPA's Minority Initiatives Committee, where he helped launch the Accounting Scholars Leadership Workshop, which has impacted over 1,500 racially and ethnically diverse undergraduate and graduate students. He is a lifetime member of the National Association of Black Accountants. A fun fact about David, David recently relocated to Florida, where he is cherishing spending time with Teresa, his wife, and at the beach with his 4-month-old grandson, Micah. David, I hope I pronounced both your wife and your grandson's name correctly. Welcome to the conversation.
Thanks, Greg. You did a good job.
Thank you. Let's hope that continues. Our second very distinguished guest is Alex Cherry, who is the Vice President of Emerging Markets and the Group Lead for Rare Disease at Pfizer. Alexandria is Vice President and serves as the New York headquarters site lead for the global Black community, whose mission is for Pfizer to be as diverse as the patients and communities they serve by ensuring the recruitment, advancement, and retention of Black colleagues at Pfizer, and engaging with internal and external partners to support efforts to increase health equity within the Black community. A fun fact about Alex, and I absolutely love this one, I can't wait to hear more about this. Her goal is to visit every country, and you guys, she's actually 40% of the way to her goal, having visited over 78 countries thus far. That is simply amazing, Alex, and welcome to you. And hopefully you'll share some of that well-traveled insight with us throughout your remarks today.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks for having me.
Next up is Angela Chang Simony. Angela joined Harvard Business, Angela is the Senior Vice President of Talent and Chief HR Officer for Harvard Business Publishing. Angela joined Harvard Business Publishing back in 2021. In this role, she leads the Human Resources and Facilities and Administration units, spearheading efforts to develop a talent roadmap that supports the business strategy and creates a deeply engaged and diverse workforce. Angela brings over 30 years of both generalist and specialist human resources experience, having worked across consumer product goods, professional services, and high tech, in addition to nonprofits. She has shepherded businesses through startup, growth, and maturity, with key responsibility for helping organizations identify and build the necessary organizational capabilities Angela earned her undergraduate degree in industrial and labor relations from Cornell and now serves on their alumni board of directors. Here's Angela's fun fact. Lots of travel here. Angela has visited over 50 countries. So she and Alex alone, we're up to over 128 various countries covered here today, you guys. I think we have a really, really diverse perspectives we're going to share today. Angela, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, Greg.
And then last but not least, Sarah Bowen, who's the Vice President of Global Diversity and Inclusion at Boeing. Sarah is responsible for developing and executing Boeing's global strategy on equity, diversity, and inclusion, ensuring compliance and building partnerships with internal and external diversity stakeholders. Prior to joining Boeing, Sarah was the global leader of inclusion and diversity, equity, and accessibility for Starbucks and Starbucks Accessibility Office, which Sarah launched in 2018. Sarah has nearly 20 years of experience in employment law, diversity and inclusion, human resource management, and equal opportunity practices. Sarah earned her Bachelor of Science degree from Northwestern University and her law degree from Stanford. Sarah has a really cool fun fact that she has a dance studio in her home. So Sarah, we cannot wait to hear more about that. And I'm sure in some ways that'll be perfect for the discussion today. Sarah, welcome.
Thank you.
I want to start the conversation, and my first question, Alex, is actually going to go to you, but I certainly welcome others who may choose to respond as well. You know, part of the discussion and part of what we want to talk about today is really changing the narrative. You know, so much of what we've seen in the media in terms of Asian and Black allyship, and the media has sort of painted a picture of these two communities that are at odds with each other constantly. I wonder if you can talk a little bit, Alex, about what kind of relationship does the media portray between Asians and Blacks? And do you think it reflects on your own experiences and maybe how these two communities engage with each other?
Sure. And thank you for the question. And I think from my perspective, media, it does not portray, I think, a fair portrayal. And I think if we're honest, we know that media is going to put forward what is sensationalized or what's going to get views, if we're being honest and transparent. And while you think about the media, and as you said, over the last few years, especially when Stop Asian Hate started, a lot of the media, most of the media portrayal was of Black people perpetuating hate against Asians, right? Whether or not the statistics show that that is something that consistently happens, I think that was the narrative that the media ran with. And naturally, when you see things like that, and for people who don't necessarily have day-to-day exposure or interactions with Black people, that's the perception, and perception becomes people's reality, whether it be true or not. And so for me, I don't think the media does a good job of portraying, I think, a fair balance of the relationships between both communities. Do I think there's work there? Naturally, I do. But I think the media probably feeds into more of the negativity and perpetuates the stereotypes than actually working to form better understanding amongst the communities. The second part of your question, is that a reflection of my experience? It's not. Right? I grew up in New York City. I grew up in the Bronx, a diverse area. Yes, for sure, right? A very, for the most part, diverse area. But I would also say this, my exposure and interactions growing up younger was also still very limited in the context of the Asian community. For the most part, they owned the beauty supply stores. They owned the local Chinese restaurants, things of that nature. So it was very, I would say, much more transactional, although part of the community, but limited in that way. And so I think that when you look at the media and the narrative that's there, I don't think that necessarily reflects what's true in my day-to-day actions. And especially moving into then my career and working with colleagues across the board, I have not experienced that. And I would say, if I take it a step further, leading, you know, a team that's based out of Asia, which is very different in terms of culture and things of that nature, that dynamic really doesn't exist. So to me, it's hard sometimes, especially when you realize if you don't have that community or that relationship with someone, let's say, if you're Asian and Black, you're going off of just what the media is putting out there, and that's not a fair representation.
So let me ask a follow-up to you, Alex. And by the way, my wife is from the Bronx too, so shout out to the Bronx. You touched on something that Anna actually spoke to in her opening remarks, which was she grew up in a neighborhood that was very much sort of a mix of Asian and Black, and had a great deal of proximity with folks from the Black community. And you touched on this by saying, in the Bronx, it's a melting pot, and there's all kinds of cultures, and there's this richness within the community. How much of does proximity play, do you think, in helping us drive understanding? Is it a catalyst, or is it oftentimes something that actually drives more of the tension?
No, so I think it is a catalyst. I think it's something that we can absolutely leverage, right? So now tables turn. I live in New Jersey. I live in Edgewater and close to Fort Lee, which is predominantly Asian, where I now live. So, right, so my tables have turned from that perspective, and the level of engagement is quite different. But I think being within proximity, being in community, being open, right? Because when you tend to share and shop at the same places and go to different situations, you absolutely engage in a much different way. And I think being part of the community is really important. And when we tend to stay separated, I think that's what tends to fuel more of that separation and lack of understanding than necessarily being together. So I think it can definitely be a catalyst to moving us forward in the right direction.
It's wonderful. Thank you for that. And Angela, I have a really important and powerful question for you. Blacks and Asians came to this country under very different circumstances. One as slaves and the other as cheap labor. With this important difference in mind, Ascend's Asian-Black Allyship paper points out several instances when laws have been used to systemically discriminate against and keep both Asians and Blacks from being considered as full human beings or citizens. In your opinion, do you think these commonalities can or should be things that actually bring us together?
I love that question. Thanks so much, Greg. I was doing my own research. I had an opportunity to present to our staff at HVP, and I learned a lot of things about the Asian American journey that I did not know about. I was actually slightly embarrassed. And as you know, there's a growing movement to now add AAPI history to elementary and secondary education, which I think is huge. I think there's 14 states who have now signed on to a curriculum. And there is so much intersectionality. There is so much commonality in our experiences. And actually, as I was giving that talk, the chatter running alongside was that a number of my Black colleagues felt triggered because they did not realize that there was so much in common about how we had been marginalized, how we had been taken advantage of, how we had been made to feel less than through systemic discrimination in our legal system. And I think once we better understand, to your point about proximity, absolutely, man. I think that's why diversity is so important in our own organizations, right? The more you have an opportunity to interact, to share experiences, whether that's in a professional context or a personal context, you understand more deeply how people think, how their culture matters to them. Alex, I think one of the things you and I share in common is travel. Right? What an eye-opening perspective that is. And so, yes, if you can get closer and deeper in, it absolutely drives a deeper understanding. So I think starting with learning about where we came from and then sharing those stories is so powerful, and it's under-leveraged. It is truly a missed opportunity. And so I would love to see organizations even taking time to do history lessons and talk about those commonalities and how they actually can amplify how we understand each other and how we can teach others who don't understand us.
Your comment about history is such a powerful one. It made me think of a couple of things and maybe a follow-up question for you. But I'm one of those people who believes that truth and reconciliation are actually sequential. And what that means is you actually do have to go back. And we were actually talking about this before we formally joined the call. And David was saying that he was attending the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. And I think it's true of the Asian AAPI community in particular. It's like so little of the history is shared. Do you think there's more we can do, Angela? I think about the the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. And now there's a, there's been an agreement that there's going to be a Latino museum by the Smithsonian similarly. Is it time that we sort of have this conversation about AAPI history and how it gets taught? I love this notion of being taught in elementary schools, but is there more that we as organizations can do to advance the history and create more awareness?
Absolutely. I mean, I think every month, right, is dedicated to a certain community. I mean, there's just so much to celebrate that goes beyond just the Black and Asian allyship, which I know is the specific topic for us. But I think even if our just our two communities could, again, understand the commonalities of our history, then we absolutely can lift each other up. And we have to make time, we have to make space, we have to make resources available in our organization. I mean, I was surprised. I held my audience for 50 minutes talking about the history of Asian Americans, and I was privileged. I was touched that there was so much interest and engagement. And frankly, there was some shock and awe there as well, because we just are so ignorant. I mean, myself, Sarah, I don't know how educated you are on the subject, but myself, not knowing as much as there is. And particularly, there are a number of Supreme Court rulings. The Chinese Exclusion Act, which is the only law on the books that specifically calls out an ethnic group by name. And it took decades for that to be overturned. And there is power in understanding where you came from so that you can chart your course about where we go, and more importantly, where we can go together.
I love it. I have the crazy thought that we should do away with Black History Month and AAPI Heritage Month, and we should just take the whole quarter on the calendar.
We should take the whole year, Greg. Let's do it. Let's do it.
And by the way, February is the shortest month of the year. I mean, what is that about?
But that's right. That's right. Not lost on us. That's right.
Let's go for the calendar. I like it, Angela. Sarah, welcome. I want to bring you into this conversation and ask you about, how the some of the events that both Anna and I touched on, the murder of George Floyd and the Atlanta spa shootings became turning points for both the Black and the Asian communities. How has your company or organizations, from your vantage point, responded to these events and maybe supported your employees, or how have you seen other companies supporting employees as a result of these two unbelievably pivotal moments?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, and you know this too, Greg, because of the work you do, the last couple of years have been some of the most intense, challenging, and just with accelerated efforts in the equity, diversity, inclusion space. So at our company, when George Floyd was murdered, it was a wake-up call for many at the company, and we did set out on a meaningful path to address it. And I think about it in three buckets. So the first one is you have to have the institutional infrastructure to support the efforts you want to undertake. And so for us, that meant establishing a racial equity steering team comprised of the company's C-suite leaders. It meant establishing specific racial equity commitments that we would track and report on. It meant establishing a racial equity task force comprised of the people that we were there to serve, who could advise us and inform us about what's working and what's not, and being transparent all along the way. And there's such a tendency, I think, for companies, and maybe Boeing in particular, to only share good news, to never share things that don't reflect well on the company. But we know that this is an issue that hasn't been solved, for hundreds of years, and we're not going to solve it in 1 year. It's going to take a while. So I think number one is just creating that infrastructure grounded in accountability and transparency. The second thing for us was really looking at our policies. I was surprised to learn, and I only learned this after George Floyd, that our policy did not require the termination of employees who violated our EEO policy. And so we were able to change that, that summer. Your question is about how do we hold ourselves accountable? It's both the infrastructure and institution, but it's also how do we hold each individual accountable? And not to dwell on the negative, but it resulted in 105 terminations at our company in 2021, that change in policy and addressing harassment and discrimination in the moment. I think the third thing is building the capability in every single person, right? being able to identify when there's bias or bigotry or hate, being able to interrupt it, and also building connection at the same time, building allyship. And this is the piece that for me has been, I think, the most unexpected joy of this work. You know, when the shootings in Atlanta happened, of course, we had a company statement. The most moving part of that for me was the way our Black employee network stood up. They wrote a letter to our Asian network and said, we feel your pain. We're standing with you. We're going to share with you the things we have learned in this journey, and we're going to be there with you every step of the way. The phone calls I got were from Black teammates. You know, after the Atlanta shooting, it was the people who were checking on me were my Black teammates and friends saying, how are you doing? And that is, you know, that to me is what gives me so much hope and feels so encouraging, that we do recognize this commonality. We do recognize some of these shared experiences, and we're not going to let the world, the society, pit us against each other. We're going to stand together in solidarity and move together to address bias and overcome bigotry. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's what comes to mind for me.
You absolutely did. And David, I'm going to ask you to respond to the same question that I asked of Sarah. But Sarah, I want to ask you a follow-up question, because you said something that's really important as we talk about organizations, and that's this notion of accountability. And how do we build in systems of accountability in this work that you and I do every day, and all of us on this call around building, trying to normalize the systems of equity. Are there things that you recommend or you found to be effective in terms of driving accountability that others should and can learn from?
I mean, I think transparency is our best friend when we're trying to drive accountability. Putting the numbers out there. Our goal, one of the commitments we made was to increase Black representation at our company by 20%. That is a concrete goal that we now have to report on at least every year, right? And not only will we hold ourselves accountable to that, but the world's going to hold us accountable to it. So I think metrics and transparency is number one. And then I think you have to bring people along on that journey with you, because we all know when you launch an effort like this, people go to their fearful place, and they can grow resentful or fearful, right? That some groups are being privileged over others now, or right, and we can't have that, or there will be backlash. And so I think a really important part of this, as we move forward with concrete goals, is to educate people about the why. And we talked about, I think before we got on this call together, when we solve the underlying issues for one group the right way, we solve them for all groups. On all ships will rise together. And that's something we've been really trying to reinforce. So accountability, I say transparency, and then bringing people along on the why. Yeah,
it's so important. The data is unemotional, right? And when you lead with the data, it really helps make really informed decisions. And David, I'm going to ask you to join the conversation. I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Sarah about, you know, how did these two events, both George Floyd's murder and the Atlanta spa shootings, how did it maybe change things at Deloitte? And were you having different conversations, and what may have changed for you and for your organization?
No, it's a great question. You know, I was listening to someone speak yesterday, and they said something that we've been dealing with as a country and a business over the last 2 years. One was the two pandemics. One was COVID-19, and the other one was the magnification of racial inequity that we've been seeing. So I think they were both extremely powerful events to nudge leadership of not only my organization, Deloitte, but organizations, leaderships of a lot of corporate America, that there's something that has to be done. when you think about leadership, there's two things they do, right? They set strategy and they execute on the strategy. And one of the things that they also have to do is manage risk. And I'm being real frank here. This became a tier one risk for a lot of organizations. So, and so I think that's why you saw a tremendous amount of focus and effort and energy around this. And I think one of the things that we got to continue to do is to make sure that if this is not on page one, it stays, at least it's on page 5. And what Sarah mentioned, which I thought was powerful, that we spent a lot of time on, is how do we make sure we keep it there at Deloitte? And accountability was something was really important to us. And we did it in 2 ways. One was, as Sarah mentioned, Deloitte also published for the first time our external data on representation, number 1. And then number 2, we published our 2025 goals and where we're going to go. So just the fact that that happened, I think that's going to stay. Because this conversation we're having today, how do we drive equity in our business? I think that is going to stay front and center, at least be on page 2 or page 3, regardless of the whatever events are there. The other thing that was done is that our leadership all had, whether or not they were driving a business, they were leading something in the enterprise, there were goals that was they all had around DE&I, and so, which of course those get pushed down. So those are 2 ways that I've seen it, but I do think those 2 events that you mentioned was key triggers to driving a lot of the action and the momentum that we have today.
Greg, if I could, I'd like to just add something, which is our employees will also hold us accountable.
Yes.
Right. I mean, they have shown a complete unwillingness to tolerate anything less than the very best ambitions in the space of DEI. Right. I mean, a lot of the Great Resignation is not just about dissatisfaction with their career development, but alignment of values, of their personal ones with the organizational ones. So transparency is a powerful tool, but also employees can be pretty vocal. And we know that they are our most important asset. So I think that's also a fantastic shift in momentum, that if you want to keep the best and brightest talent, you have to be mindful that when you make commitments, they're going to hold their feet to the fire.
I think that's such an important point, Angela. And, I could not agree with you more. And I think employees have done exactly what they should do, is they are actually, going back to your point, Sarah, about accountability, is they're actually holding their employees accountable to living up to the words that they're actually putting on paper. If you're telling me that you believe in this notion of equity and inclusion, then I'm going to actually ask you to have a point of view on some of these issues that are important to me. I tell my team all the time, like I've never had more job clarity in my entire career, because in doing this work, if as a company we say that our purpose is to actually power human potential, then the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is to make sure that that statement's true for all your stakeholders, right? And that starts with your employees. And employees are no longer giving companies a pass to live up to that. And Alex, I'd love to hear you sort of weigh in on maybe how Pfizer thinks about that, and how do you both hold yourselves accountable, and maybe how does Pfizer also hold other leaders in the organization accountable?
Yeah, so thanks. And I would say it's quite similar to what you heard from our other panelists when it's interesting because I always try to think back to like, what was it about the death of George Floyd that really made everyone take a look in the mirror and say, we need to do something different and we need to really address this. And I think you said it well, David, that it was really up there, right? In terms of saying the risk to what this means for us in terms of our organization and our talent and things of that nature really became mission critical. And so for Pfizer, one of the things that I think their commitment and what did make us proud and made me proud really was about saying, okay, not only do we improve our diversity and inclusion, but how do we foster an environment of inclusion, right? What does that really look like? How do we make sure that as we heard, we have goals. Just like anything else, we have goals for our revenue projections, we have goals for a number of things. And we don't just simply say we're going to do it, right? We hold ourselves accountable to it. So what happened was that the global Black community specifically, we were charged with really putting together what we called our 6 commitments to action, which was really about clearly identifying the key components and tenets that we felt as an organization, Pfizer really needed to focus on and really drive for us, right? And that was really about not only progressing Black colleagues within the organization and things like that, but also how did it impact our communities when looking at supplier diversity, right? We work with a lot of different vendors. Are we looking at that and looking at making sure we have diversity amongst suppliers, looking at clinical trial recruitment, right? We're also in the time of the COVID situation. We've developed the vaccine. What does that look like for us? How are we making sure that we're recruiting and we have that diversity amongst there? We know that in the Black community, very different numbers, very different statistics when it related to deaths and events like that. But also as we look at talent as well as acquisition, how do we make sure we're being really honest and truthful with ourselves? And that was really important. And that was something, you know, as we looked at the organization and Pfizer, they committed to, right? With that, at the same time, one of the things we looked at was the underrepresentation of Black colleagues at the VP and higher level. And that was something that there was a really big gap. And so the organization made a commitment that says, we want to take a look at this. We want to achieve parity, you know, in the US for minorities across the board, especially as we said for Blacks and Hispanic and Latinos, and put numbers behind that. And so to me, I think that that was really, you know, some of the initial steps of saying, let's take a look in the mirror. Let's be very honest with ourselves, because for a long time, I had been part of the global Black community and they were not releasing the numbers. So you're not alone, Sarah, you said, was it maybe just Boeing? It wasn't, right? I think a lot of organizations didn't feel comfortable releasing those numbers. But I think once they understood that that was the only way to truly hold themselves accountable and put it on paper and see it, and then start to track it, would we believe and have faith in the confidence that the organization was committed to what they were saying they were committed to? So to me, I think that that's some of the representation and things I saw within my organization as we took a look at things and how we continue to progress today.
That's it. That's fantastic. David, like to come back to you for a second, if I can. Do you see a sense of, and I welcome comments from any of the panelists on this one. David, do you see a sense of competition between Asian and Black employee groups to secure, you know, attention, awareness with other senior leaders in the organization? And do you feel that certain groups are prioritized over others in organizations for leadership?
Yeah, no, listen, I'm glad I got this question, because it was interesting, because I experienced it, and let me give you my viewpoint. So I think you know, it was more of a sense, what I saw was a sense of being left behind, and whether or not you were the Asian community, Latin community, Latinx, LGBTQ community. That was a concern, right? And clearly understandable where, you know, where I would say the firm took a Black first lens, right? Let's be transparent. Mm-hmm. And I would say, and you know, and I lived right out of DC, right across the bridge going into DC, and I would say when the Black Lives Matters March happened, and I went over, and my wife and I walked over, we saw the stream of individuals walking over. It wasn't just Black folks. If you want to see a melting pot, it was a melting pot. And that's just, and then that in my mind was the sense of what we're talking about today was allyship. And I don't think it wasn't for that level of allyship that everyone said enough's enough, right? And so I think that was important. So coming back to us, we did think about that, Greg, and it was a fair challenge. And as we were thinking about the Black Action Council and what our guiding principles were, you know, it was very clear that we represent the voices of our Black professionals. Accountability was a big a big piece of our guiding principles, make data driven and action. But the fifth one we put in there, and we use some fancy word, but we had to, whatever we were doing, had to have spillover impact to other groups, right, that are facing the same challenge. Let me give you a couple of examples of how that came to life for us. One of the things that came out of the Black Action Council, that we had a firm-wide anti-racism training. It was a mandatory training that all of our professionals had to take at all levels. When we looked at the scenarios, when we developed the scenarios in that training together, it was scenarios that had all racially and ethnically diverse groups, right, in there. So it wasn't just Black, it was developed by the Black Action Council. We started to develop, again, in the allyship, let's do these uncensored stories where we can start having our Black professionals share their story, what they experienced. That's been expanded. If you look at it, the firm, and by the way, it's been award-winning, and I'm very proud of it. But now that's been established, and all of the other minority groups are doing that. We looked at the performance management process. And by the way, the firm will say, if you speak to the CEO, there's bias in those processes, right? And so, and when we looked at that and we made recommendations, which the firm has implemented, and there's more coming to improve the performance management processes, it's just not for Black folks, it's for everyone, right? So everyone is going to benefit from that. So my story is that when we're talking about allyship, I think we have to come together, and the power of all of us together, because this is not a zero-sum game. I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I think if we're gonna continue to move the needle, everyone has to be able to participate in the journey and have benefits from the journey. And I do think about, the call of to action, because one of the things that we were very focused on was action. And I do think about, the call we're on today with Ascend. There's another organization out there called NABA, National Association for Black Accountants. There's another organization that represents our Latinx professional called Alpha. And I think we need to think about how we're going to come together and how we're going to together drive change. And I think we'd be surprised in the impact we could have if we join forces. So I'm not sure I answered the question. I'm happy to if you have any clarifications, but that's my view, and that's how we have thought about it. But it's a great question that we all need to think about.
I think you did. I think you answered it well, and I'd love to hear, Sarah as a global head of diversity for 2 major corporations. I'd love to hear your perspective on that same question about whether, within organizations, Asians and Blacks feel like they're in competition with each other, for many of these high-profile positions. And how do you see that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and similar to David, when we launched our racial equity task force and commitments, we heard from not just our Asian group, but all minority groups, similar to what David shared, of that fear of being left behind, which was very legitimate. And so, what I would share is very similar to David, and that is all of the steps we're taking are designed to drive equity, period, right? It's not preference for Black people, it's equity, because when we have truly equitable processes that are objective and fair and transparent, diversity will flourish. Bottom line. Yeah. What's required for meritocracy is equal opportunity. And when you have a true meritocracy, you will have diversity. One example we heard through listening to some of our Black teammates was, hey, there's a lot of shoulder tapping when it comes to promotions into executive roles. We don't even know those exist. How could we possibly compete for them? And there was truth to that. They were confidential requisitions that were recruited behind the scenes. So we changed that. We said, all right, executive director positions, we're now posting. And that benefits everyone, right? It becomes more equitable, it becomes more fair, open, transparent. And as a result, we have seen more diversity rise into those executive ranks. So it's a similar story. And the other thing I would add to this is Our Asian network during May, we're Asian Heritage Month, they challenged us to look at leadership parity numbers. And I don't know, I think Ascend, maybe you shared some research on this, which is looking at the representation in individual contributor ranks, and then what is the ratio as you move up into leadership and management ranks. Mm-hmm. Asians have the lowest ratio, or the highest ratio. It's anyway, I'm not sure the math, but it's kind of the least progression into management of any minority group. And they've been trying to raise awareness to that. So I think each group has slightly different challenges, right, which require attention and focus and education. But at the bottom line, we're all striving for the same thing, which is we want to be judged on the merit of our work, the experience we bring, the benefit we bring to this team, not on what we look like or someone's stereotype of what we bring to the table. So it's a journey for sure. And I feel like we're just, we're still in the beginning stages of it, but I'm really excited for the future because every change we make leads to better outcomes. So
I actually want to come back to you later, but Angela, I want to bring you into this conversation and have you respond to the question. But before I do, I did want to say, Sarah, you said, in order to ensure the meritocracy, you need equal opportunity. That, in our culture, that's called taking them to church. So that's church right there. So I appreciate that. I wrote that one down. But Angela, how are you seeing it from your perspective? Do you see these communities, employees, workplaces being places where minorities feel they're in competition with each other? Or are there ways that we can continue to expand opportunity for everyone, right? So much of this work, which we're talking about, is actually how do we bake a bigger pie, not dividing up the pie into smaller pieces. But, I firmly believe, and I say often in my organization, inclusion actually is the growth strategy. Like it actually is a catalyst for growth. And if we do this right, the pie gets bigger for everybody. But Angela, I'd be really curious to get your perspective on whether we're creating more competition amongst groups that should be in solidarity, or can we grow this pie even bigger?
Yeah, I love the metaphor about the pie. I mean, I think you're clearly talking to organizations that are fairly mature in this journey. And my concern is about those who are young in their journey, both in their thinking and in terms of the time and effort they've invested in this effort. And so for those organizations for whom they're just trying to get more women in their executive teams, right? And they get one person of color and they're like, woo, right? That is definitely a cause for celebration if they're starting from a completely white board. Mm-hmm. So there is sort of this artificial suppression that we've got one, and so that's good. And boy, that was exhausting and that was super difficult, right? We're like so many years off from getting greater parity, right? And we have all these ceilings, the bamboo ceiling, the glass ceiling, right? I mean, there's so many barriers. And I think for me, coming from the HR function, one of the things that Sarah talked about, she talked about policies, is that you've got to unwind all that stuff in your organization that holds people back. So we are launching a completely brand new career pathing framework that takes out the politicization of this promotion discussions. It is about meritocracy. It's not about visibility. It's not about time and chair. It's about what are you contributing? How are you delivering impact? But without systems and the commitment, you're going to fall short. And so those organizations that are only sort of half-hearted or feel like, okay, one, check the box, that's good enough, you're not going to bring about real change. And so clearly we believe that the pie can be infinitely bigger, right? Because we believe we should have the whole dang pie, right? Because we deserve to be there and we have the appetite, right? So we just got to get frankly, I think we need to change some of the bakers. Like I'm killing this metaphor.
You're killing it. That's also church right there.
Right? I mean, we talked about the discomfort, and some of this is the institutions of longstanding white leadership decision makers. And how do we shift that to be a much more decisive group, right? We've got to get more bakers in that kitchen. And so that to me is how we make the pie bigger. It is a really difficult journey, but I love hearing about the best practices from my fellow leaders here. And we've just got to get it into the organizations that haven't even started the conversation, right?
Yeah.
And that to me is a real challenge.
And if I could just add something, because I think, Angela, you hit on it. And even though I know that the conversation here is about Black and Asian, but I think you're spot on, right? When you take a look at the people in the roles and the decisions, right? Really, it's not a diverse pool. And the more that we have a seat at the table, Asian, Hispanic, Black, that's when the opportunity in the pie continues to increase, right? That really is. And I think one of the things that, as I heard from all of you, and I think about what, as my organization did, also trying to take a look is making sure that our panels are diverse as well in terms of who's doing the interviewing, right? That's just as important as well. And or pushing back when we get candidates in our pool and we don't see that level of diversity in the candidates that are being brought to us. That also is important, right? We know geography, things like that play a part, but when you live, especially like I do, in a metropolitan city like New York City, you can't tell me there's not diverse candidates to be had, right? But why do I have 90% that are Caucasian? That doesn't make sense, right? So I think it's making sure we each step up and we really ask the question and we hold ourselves and our colleagues accountable to that, because only then will those shifts start to change as well. But I think it's a great point, Angela. We have to diversify amongst, even during that recruitment and retention time.
Yeah, Greg, if I could jump in for 10 seconds and just remesh something that Angela said, right? And we're all on a journey for top talent, especially coming out of colleges and universities. They're asking a whole different series of questions, right? They're asking around, what's your purpose other than profit? We're hearing that. They're asking about DE&I. Tell me about your leadership team and tell me what it looks like and tell me about my journey and how I can get there. If you can't answer those questions, or you can't demonstrate a strong commitment, you're probably not going to attract those. You're going to have a tough time attracting top talent going forward. So I think that is going to be a big thing that's also going to drive this forward for us, as that next generation is going to really, push the needle that we start to really change the dynamics around DE&I. Just wanted to add on to that.
It's a great point, David, and I would add to that. DEI is certainly a critical part of any company's value proposition, your brand, all of it. And we likely have time for one more question, so I'd like each of you to answer it. And Sarah, I'm going to start with you. What kind of support would you like to see from the community itself, both the Asian and Black community? And are there more that companies can do at large that may be on your wish list of things that maybe our audience can take away as things to be thinking about? So first and foremost, what would you like to see each of the communities do as a starting point?
That's a great question. Thanks for starting with me. Well, I think, first of all, everyone is, we've got to resist the pressure to be pitted against each other. We've got to resist that pressure to say, what about me? And instead to say, this, come to the table with me and work together, because we are all in it together. We all stand to gain by working together to address the institutional and systemic biases that exist everywhere. So I would say that number one is just be mindful of it, resist that urge. And then for our communities in particular, we can be amplifiers for each other. So if we're in a meeting and someone is talking about, how, one particular group is left out, speak up and say, hey, this is a conversation for all of us, not just one group. And I would like to hear from my colleague over here. I think it's just those little moments that come up every single day where we can act as bias interrupters. Fantastic. And for organizations, I would say, be open to changing. As we've talked about, it could be from a policy standpoint. It could be from a leadership standpoint. As many have pointed out, the rules, the policies, the infrastructure of our organizations have been built in some cases, like Boeing's, over more than 100 years by a predominantly white, predominantly male team. Naturally, there's going to be bias built into our systems. And if we really want to be the equitable, diverse, and inclusive company we know we need to be, we have to be willing to change some of those things. So that's what I would say.
Outstanding, outstanding. Angela, how about you? What do you think?
So I think one of the things we can do, so we're actually just starting to form our first ERGs. And I think we need to provide opportunities for them to come together, right? So, I mean, obviously those are safe spaces for affinity groups to share their experiences, find comfort, find uplifting moments to be. But I also think that there's great synergistic opportunities. And I think we need to open up the communication channels so that they can come together more often. And I don't know that we've thought really intentionally about that. Again, they're just forming, right? So a little bit, we need to get them to create their own space first. But I think pretty quickly on, especially as they're on this journey together so early, we also should see them as part of a larger collective and an opportunity to talk about their lived experience, whether it's gender-based, race-based, neurodiversity-based, first generation college-based, whatever that is, there are going to be intersectionalities. And I think that's really the root of what makes diversity such a fascinating subject that evolves, is that there are commonalities, and we'll celebrate the differences, but there are more commonalities than we think.
Well said. David, thoughts? What can each community do?
Yeah, I'll go back to where Anna started the conversation and around allyship. And I'm not as smart as everyone in this call. I'm a pretty simple person, but allyship in its simplest form is treating people the exact same way you want to be treated, right? That's why I look at it. I know there's a lot of fun, fancy definitions out there. And it's going to require us to continue to be open-minded. It's going to require us to be curious and meet individuals where they are. And why I think that's so important is that there's powers in numbers, right? And I think, in some ways, society would love us to continue to be separate versus coming together. So I could imagine what we can do if we rally and come together as one. The Asian, the Black community, Latin America, Latinx. I think we'll have more power there. We can get even stuff done even quicker. So allyship is foundational, and if we just continue to explore, we continue to learn more and treat people as we want to be treated, I think we'll be in a much better place.
And I would add, David, that we should add our white colleagues to that.
I agree.
Right, to that as well. And part of that is bringing them on our journey because they can be one of our greatest allies as well.
And they benefit as well, Angela, to the point that I think we've made so often. The true beneficiaries of DEI work is actually all of us. As organizations and communities. And Alex, I do want to give you the opportunity to sort of wrap this question and sort of answer what can each of the communities do to work in each other?
No, so thanks. And obviously I echo the sentiment of what everyone has said. I think there's a nice quote that Brian Lawrence said, who's an author, and he said, proximity breeds empathy, distance breeds suspicion, right? So I think the closer we work together and foster a sense of interconnectedness, the more we will have empathy for each other and our struggles. I think that's important, right? I think the same way that within the Black community, for us to hear Black Lives Matter from our Asian colleagues and neighbors is just as important it is for Black colleagues to say stop Asian hate, right? We want to know that we are seen and we are heard, and that literally we have representation and understanding from other communities. And I think only then will we really work together and make sure we do that. And I think it also starts in our community, right? How we engage and interact, and those experiences are just as important as they are in the workplace. So to me, I think it really is about making sure that we show up for each other, right? In the simplest way. Like David, it could be simple. I think it's how do we show up for each other? How do we speak up? I think Sarah said that if you hear something that really you just know is wrong, like how do we be comfortable and be okay and be courageous in saying, I'm not okay with that, right? especially when you're witnessing it firsthand. So to me, I think those are some of the key things that we need to make sure we're doing. We're having a little bit more empathy. We're really looking at our community. And I think we're asking ourselves, we're putting the mirror up to our own face to say, what role am I playing in this? Right? Because if I'm not part of the solution, I'm part of the problem. So.
Woo, that's a powerful place to end. Alex, thank you so much. We are at time, but I do want to, before I thank each of you, just I'll give each of you 10 seconds if you'd like to just share one final thought that leaves you hopeful. And again, I'm going to hold you to 10 seconds because we are out of time. Sarah, I'm going to give you a heads up. I'm coming to you first. But while we're doing that, I do just want to thank all of you for delivering on what Angela sort of challenged us all on at the very beginning, was to just have an energetic conversation. Sarah, in 10 seconds or less, what makes you hopeful?
Oh, well, my heart is full. I'm hopeful because of people like you, Greg, and Alex, and Angela, and David. We've got to keep having these conversations, getting uncomfortable, and that's how we're going to make progress together.
Perfect. David, how about you? 10 seconds or less.
I'm hopeful that the next generation is going to require us to continue to make change and to drive the diversity and equitable outcomes that they're going to want to see.
Excellent. Thank you. Angela, how about you?
I'll piggyback on what David said. I think the next generation is going to be part of the change. They have a very different perspective. They have an idealism and an optimism and ambition. I'm learning things from my adult children now, and I think that's incredibly hopeful.
Powerful. Thank you, Angela. And Alex, what leaves you hopeful?
What leaves me hopeful, I think it's having these types of conversations and seeing them happen throughout different organizations, that we're not taking our foot off the gas, right? Normally, I think we've kind of started and then we let up, but I'm hopeful that the momentum will continue. And as they say, the march will continue. So that's what I'm hopeful about.
Well, I just want to thank all of you for letting me go on this journey with you today. I learned so much today. I know all of our listeners and viewers will also agree that they learned a ton, and just appreciate all of you bringing your experiences, your talents, and your perspective on such an important topic. And I was also going to do my hopeful 10 seconds, but I'm going to steal a phrase that I heard one of you say earlier. I think it was you, Sarah, and that was unexpected joy. And I think I would leave you with that thought. It was just a joy to certainly meet all of you, but to really dig into these issues, and a lot more to come, and we have a lot more work to do. But thank you all for sharing your thoughts today and for being with us. It was a pleasure.
Thanks,
Greg.
Thank
Great
you.
job.
And thank you, Ascend.
Thanks to our speakers, their organizations, and all of you, our guests, for making this such an informative and engaging forum. Ascend Foundation supports initiatives, campaigns, and scholarships to support the Pan-Asian community, and conducts research and provides thought leadership to enable Pan-Asians to become better leaders, innovators, role models, and catalysts for workplace and societal change. To learn more about the unknown histories of Asians and Blacks in America and how to foster greater Asian-Black allyship in the workplace, read our latest position paper, Elevating Asian-Black Allyship in Corporate America, at www.AscendLeadershipFoundation.org. Thank you very much and have a great day.